He died a free man. That is the part that never leaves you once you hear this story. He lived his life. He grew old. He had decades of ordinary days, groceries and television, and the slow passage of time that most people take for granted. He died in 2019 at 72 years old in Windsor, Ontario. And nobody knew. Nobody knew that the man dying quietly in that city was the same man who had pulled a 25-year-old Welsh nanny into the Rouge River in the summer of 1982. The same man who had driven a 23-year-old woman 120 kilometers north of Toronto in September of 1983 and shot her twice in a remote field. The same man who had walked into a nursing assistant's apartment in 1997 and beaten her to death before her coworker found her the next morning when she did not show up for her shift. 3 women, 15 years, 3 completely different methods, 3 completely different locations, 3 women who did not know each other, had never met, had nothing in common except the city they were living in. And one man's DNA, collected at every single scene, preserved in evidence bags for decades, sitting in a database waiting for technology that did not exist, yet connecting all 3 of them to the same killer. His name was Kenneth Smith. And on the 11th of December, 2025, Toronto police stood in front of cameras at a press conference and said something that the families of Christine Prince, Claire Samson, and Gracelyn Greenidge had been waiting their entire adult lives to hear. We know who did this. But here is the thing that makes this case unlike almost any other serial killer story you have ever heard. There is no trial coming. There is no courtroom. There is no sentencing. There is no moment where a judge looks a killer in the eyes and says you will spend the rest of your life in a cage for what you did. Kenneth Smith will never be held accountable. Not because investigators failed, not because the evidence was not enough, but because he got away with it for so long that time itself became his defense. He died before they found him. And somewhere out there, investigators believe there are more victims. Women whose families are still waiting. Women whose names are not yet connected to his. Women who may have crossed paths with Kenneth Smith on a Toronto street and never came home. The investigation is not over. Today we are going to Toronto. We are going to meet Christine, Claire, and Gracelyn. We are going to follow 43 years of cold cases that were never connected until a genetic genealogy company cracked open a DNA database and found a family tree that led to a dead man's door. And we are going to sit with the question that nobody has answered yet. How many more women did Kenneth Smith kill? Before we go to 1982, before we stand on a Toronto streetcar platform in the middle of the night and watch a 25-year-old woman step off into the dark, you need to know who these 3 women were. Not the case files, not the evidence bags, them. Christine Prince was 25 years old in the summer of 1982. She was from Wales. She had come to Toronto the way young people come to cities drawn by the possibility of it. The aliveness of a new place. She was working as a nanny, building something. The kind of life that a 25-year-old builds in a city she has chosen for herself, with friends she is still making and places she is still discovering. On the evening of the 21st of June, 1982, she went out with friends. A normal night. The kind of night that exists in the background of a life, unremarkable, forgettable, except that it was the last one she ever had. She took a streetcar home on Street Clare Avenue West after midnight, stepped off, started walking. Her body was found the following day in the Rouge River. She had been sexually assaulted, struck on the head, and drowned. She was far from home, in a city she had chosen, on a street she had walked before. And nobody was charged. Claire Samson was 23 years old in September of 1983. A year after Christine Prince was pulled from the Rouge River, a year during which Kenneth Smith had continued living in Toronto, continued moving through the city, continued being invisible to investigators who had no way of knowing that the same man would do this again. Claire was last seen near Jarvis and Gerrard Streets in downtown Toronto. She got into a beige vehicle driven by an older white man. She was found the next day in a remote, wooded area in Oro-Medonte Township, 120 kilometers north of the city, shot twice. Someone had driven her there. Someone had taken the time to put that distance between the city and what they planned to do. Someone who knew that the further from Toronto, the colder the trail. Nobody was charged. 14 years passed. 14 years of Kenneth Smith living his life. And then, July 29th, 1997, a nursing assistant named Gracelyn Greenidge did not show up for her shift. Her coworker went to check on her. She was found in her apartment on Driftwood Avenue in North York, dead from blunt force trauma, 41 years old, originally from Barbados. A woman who had built a career and a home and a life in Toronto. A woman whose coworker knew immediately that something was wrong when she did not come through the door, because Gracelyn was the kind of person who always came through the door. DNA evidence was collected at the scene. Nobody was charged. And Kenneth Smith went about his life for 22 more years before his heart stopped and the world he had been hiding from finally started looking harder. Here is the detail that investigators sat with for decades and could not solve. There was nothing connecting these three women. Not geography. Christine was found in the Rouge River, Claire in rural Oromodonte, Gracelyn in her own apartment. Not method one drowned after a sexual assault, one shot twice in a field, one beaten in her home. Not demographics, a Welsh nanny in her mid-20s, a young Toronto woman in her early 20s, a Barbadian nursing assistant in her 40s. Three women, three scenes, three completely different circumstances. The only thread running through all of them was invisible. A DNA profile, an unknown male, collected at each scene and preserved through decades of evidence storage, through the 90s, through the 2000s, through the 10s, waiting for the science to catch up with what the biology already knew. In 2016, a forensic scientist uploaded one of those DNA profiles to Canada's National DNA Database. It matched an unknown male profile connected to another case. Investigators went quiet with that for a moment. Then they started pulling threads. In 2017, they pulled a third thread. And the unknown male profile, connected to Christine Prince's case and Claire Samson's case, was now also connected to Gracelyn Greenidge's 1997 murder. One man, three women, 15 years, three different methods, three different locations, and a DNA profile with no name attached to it. That is where the investigation sat for 5 more years. Before we go any further, because I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to sit with it before you answer. 3 different women, 3 different scenes, 3 completely different ways of killing. Most serial killers have a signature, a method they return to, a type of victim they target, a pattern that eventually makes them visible to investigators. Kenneth Smith had no visible pattern, not one that investigators could see without the DNA. And that invisibility kept him free for 43 years. So here is the question. Drop it in the comments right now. Do you think investigators missed something, a connection they should have seen earlier? Or do you think some killers are genuinely impossible to catch without the technology that did not exist until recently? Because that debate is at the center of how we talk about cold cases and what we expect from investigations, and I want to know where you stand. Please, subscribe right now. Hit that notification bell. This case is 5 months old, and virtually nobody on YouTube has covered it properly yet. When new victims are identified and investigators believe there are more, this channel will be first. Share this video. 1 share. 1 more person who hears Christine's name, Claire's name, Gracelyn's name. No, let us talk about the company that cracked this case open, because what they did in 2022 changed everything. Othram. That is the name of the private forensic laboratory based in Texas that Toronto Police Service brought in to work the Kenneth Smith case in 2022. The same company that has been quietly revolutionizing cold case investigation across North America for years. The same technology that helped identify the Golden State Killer. The same methodology that has been putting names to Jane Does and connecting DNA profiles to family trees in cases that investigators had given up on. Forensic genetic genealogy. Here is how it works without getting lost in the science of it. A DNA profile extracted from a crime scene contains information about a person's biological relatives, not just them, but their cousins, their siblings, their parents, their children. When that profile is uploaded to databases that contain millions of consumer DNA samples from ancestry services, the kind of thing people spit into tubes and mail off to find out where their great-grandparents came from, the software can find partial matches, distant relatives, people who share enough genetic material with the unknown profile to map a family tree backward. You start with a stranger's DNA and you find their third cousin twice removed. And from there you build a tree, and the tree has branches, and some of those branches lead to people who were alive during the crime, who lived in the right city, who fit the right age range. And then investigators start knocking on doors. In 2025, after 3 years of building that family tree from Kenneth Smith's DNA, investigators identified close familial relatives of the offender. The Center of Forensic Sciences conducted a final comparison. On the 3rd of December, 2025, Kenneth Smith was conclusively identified as the killer of Christine Prince, Claire Samson, and Gracelyn Greenidge. 8 days later, Toronto police stood in front of cameras and told the world. And Detective Sergeant Steve Smith, no relation, said something that landed with the weight of 43 years behind it. He said these women were never forgotten. Kenneth Smith had a history. That is the detail that makes this case something more than a forensic triumph, something darker. Something that raises questions about what the system knew and when and what it did with what it knew. He had been known to police. He had a history of sexual assault. He had been jailed at least once before the first 2 murders, twice before Gracelyn Greenidge was killed in 1997. Known to police. History of sexual assault. Jailed multiple times. And 3 women were killed on his watch anyway. This is not a case where an unknown predator appeared from nowhere and disappeared back into invisibility. This is a case where a man with a documented history of violence against women was living in Toronto across 15 years of murders, and nobody connected him to any of them. Not because investigators were not working, not because they did not care, but because the technology did not exist to make the invisible thread visible. Because 3 women killed in 3 different ways in 3 different locations did not look like the work of one person until the DNA said otherwise. And because Kenneth Smith understood whether consciously or instinctively that variety was his protection, different method each time, different location each time, different type of victim each time. He gave investigators nothing to pattern match against, nothing to see coming. He was invisible until he was dead. And even now, even with a name, even with a face on a press conference screen, even with a conclusive DNA identification, he cannot be touched. Deputy Chief Rob Johnson stood at that podium on the 11th of December, 2025, and said it directly. He said his death means he will never be held to account in a court of law. And we recognize the impact that has on families who have waited so long for justice. He will never be held to account. Let that sit for a moment. Christine Prince's family has waited 43 years, Claire Samson's family, 42, Gracelyn Greenidge's family, 28. And the answer they finally received, the answer that took genetic genealogy in a Texas laboratory and years of investigative work, is a name attached to a dead man. He escaped. Not from prison, not from a courtroom, from time itself. Here is the second thing I need to stop and ask you today. Because we just arrived at the moral center of this case. Is this justice? A name, a press conference, a confirmed identification, the certainty finally that a specific man killed these 3 specific women. The knowledge that the families of Christine and Claire and Gracelyn can now say with complete confidence, we know who did this. Is that justice? Or is justice something that requires a courtroom? A sentence? A moment where the person who caused that harm has to stand in a room and face the consequences in front of the people they hurt? Tell me in the comments, because this question does not have a clean answer. And the families of these 3 women have had to sit with their own version of it since the 11th of December, 2025. Did they get justice? Drop it below. Because that conversation is exactly why this channel exists, to sit with the questions that do not resolve cleanly and think about them together. Please subscribe right now. Hit that notification bell. Because investigators have said there may be more victims. When another woman is identified, when another family gets a press conference of their own, you need to be here. There is a photograph of Kenneth Smith that Toronto police released at the press conference. A man in his 50s or 60s, ordinary looking. The kind of face that does not announce itself. The kind of face you pass in a grocery store, or a parking lot, or on a streetcar platform in the middle of the night and think nothing of. That is the thing about this case that follows you after you stop watching. Not the DNA, not the genealogy, not the forensic science that finally broke the case open after 43 years. The ordinariness of him. He lived in Windsor when he died, a city of 230,000 people on the Canadian border across from Detroit. He had a life there. Neighbors, a daily routine. Whatever quiet, ordinary thing a 72-year-old man does with his days. And somewhere in that life, in whatever he told himself about who he was and what he had done and what it meant, were 3 women who went into the dark on Toronto streets and never came home. Christine Prince stepped off a streetcar on Street Clare Avenue West at midnight and started walking. Claire Samson got into a beige vehicle near Jarvis and Gerrard and disappeared into the space between the city and a remote field 120 kilometers north of it. Gracelyn Greenidge went home to her apartment on Driftwood Avenue and never made it to the shift her coworker was expecting her for. 3 women. 3 evenings. 3 moments of ordinary life that became something else because Kenneth Smith was in the same city and he had already made a decision about what kind of man he was. OPP Chief Superintendent Karen Gano said something at that press conference that deserves to be heard again. She said the investigation does not end. This case stands as a powerful reminder that while time may pass, our commitment to victims and their families does not fade. We will continue to pursue the truth, no matter how long it takes. Because no victim will be forgotten, and every family deserves answers. No victim will be forgotten. That is the promise. And investigators in Toronto are making it now in the cases they have named, and in the cases they have not yet confirmed about women whose names may still be out there. Connected to the same DNA, waiting in the same database, waiting for the family tree to branch in the right direction. If you knew Gracelyn Greenidge, if you knew Christine Prince, if you knew Claire Samson, if you knew Kenneth Smith and something about him never sat right with you, the Toronto Police Service Cold Case Unit is still working this investigation. The DNA is still in the database. The family tree is still being mapped. And if you know of a woman who disappeared in Toronto or the surrounding area between 1982 and 2019 and was never found, that information matters. Right now, today. Before you go, I need one more thing from you. Tell me in the comments, which of these 3 women's stories hits you hardest and why? Is it Christine the Welsh nanny far from home, building a life in a new city, stepping off a streetcar at midnight? Is it Claire getting into a car with a stranger, driven 120 kilometers into the dark, shot twice in a field? Is it Gracelyn found by a coworker who knew immediately that something was wrong because Gracelyn was the kind of person who always showed up? Tell me, because these 3 women are not a case number or a press conference or a DNA profile. They are people, and the way we talk about them matters. Please subscribe to the Cold Case Signals. Ring that notification bell. Share this video. 1 share. 1 more person who hears these names. 1 more signal sent back to 1982 on behalf of a 25-year-old Welsh nanny who stepped off a Toronto streetcar and never made it home. We have more cases coming, more signals, more stories told the way they deserve, with depth, with truth, and with absolute respect for every woman at the center of them. I will see you on the next video.